Do you want to play push like an instrument, kind of like this? Hey yo, it's Alex from My Music. I'm a musician, producer, and certified audio engineer here to help you level up your music and unlock your creativity. In this video, I'm going to reveal the simple steps for how any level of musician can easily transform their playing ability on push to build the foundations in order to master it. Here's what we're going to cover: what music theory is, all the concepts to understand it, and how to use it to get creative with your own music, which is the whole point anyway. So by the end of this video, you'll know everything you need to effortlessly play push like an instrument. But first, let me share you what happened when I didn't used to know any theory whatsoever and the change it made for me when I did. Learn the rules like a pro so you can break them like an artist. Pablo Picasso. As I got into making music, I never cared much for rules. I was a guitarist, rocker, and metalhead in my teens and did not give a about theory. I've always preferred music that was a little bit more unique, experimental, a little bit out there, and clearly didn't follow any rules. So for years, I'd never learned any theory and did everything by ear. Over time, I realized that I really couldn't communicate ideas with other musicians effectively, and that I'd waste a lot of time searching for notes on my fretboard, searching for notes in the DAW, and I had no labels for the sounds that I loved, which made it a lot harder to remember them. So music theory is a tool just like anything else, but it's powerful to know the rules so that you can break them like an artist. I'm all about breaking rules. I'm all about pushing the boundaries, self-discovery, self-expression, and really discovering yourself through music without necessarily needing to follow constraints or formula. So if you'd like to learn more about my approach to unlocking your creativity as an artist and finishing music that you're proud of, check out my masterclass with the link in the description. I put all my best insights that I've learned on my journey as an artist, and it will be a massive help to you to compose, produce, and mix music that not only sounds pro, but that expresses you in a deep, meaningful way. All right, number one, we are starting with the language of music. In Western music, the language of music are made of the letters from the English alphabet. So let's break down the notes in the musical alphabet and where they are on push. Just like any language that we speak is made of letters, the language of music is made up of notes. They go from A to G, then it repeats from A. It's common to look at the notes starting from C instead, since they are all the white keys on a keyboard. It's easy to play, easy to remember, and a ton of songs use the key of C. So the settings that we're going to use for push are as follows. I'm going to go ahead and hit the scale button. And first and foremost, the layout is going to be in fourths so that each subsequent row of pads is tuned a fourth apart, right? So we have C, we have F, B flat, so on and so forth. And we're going to go ahead and stick in C major for now, just to keep it consistent as we're learning the names of the notes. And we're going to be in chromatic mode. Instead of in key mode, we're going to be in chromatic. And this is key to be able to play push as an instrument, so they have access to all of the notes. You can play outside keys, you can modulate, you can truly play this like a full instrument, whereas in key mode is a little bit more limited. Now, with the lit up pads in C major, okay, we have the notes C, D, E, F, G, A, B, and then back at C. So it cycles all the way around once we get through the musical alphabet. So for example, if I take off fixed mode for now, which we'll talk more about later, and I go into the key of E flat, now the pads have rearranged themselves to E flat. So if you're in E flat here, we know that this is E, here's F sharp, here's G, so on and so forth. But for now, we're going to keep it in C major. I'm going to turn back fixed mode on. Next, let's go a little bit deeper on exploring the note layout on push. Okay, so when we're in C major, all of the lit up pads in the chromatic mode are the same as the white keys on a keyboard. Okay, so if I go ahead and play up these lit pads, check out how it's the same thing on a keyboard in terms of the white keys, right? So this is probably the most powerful way to learn theory with push, is to be on C major in chromatic mode, because now we have the same visual feedback as a piano. One thing to note is that you'll notice that on push, sometimes when we play a note, the pads turn green in multiple places. And this is just to help identify the same notes depending where you are on push. So for example, if I play up the scale C, D, E, F, you'll notice that F is lit up here as well as over here because these are the same note. Okay, so that's just some visual feedback that push is giving you to show you where you can play the same note at different places on the pads. There's a lot of different ways that you can play the same chord on push, which is one of its advantages. But for example, let's go ahead and play an F major 7 chord. Okay, so I know that I have an F right here. I could play F major 7 like this. I could play it like this. I could play it like this, right? I could even play it like this if I wanted to. Okay, there's a lot of different ways that we can play the same thing. Same goes for something like maybe D minor 9. Okay, we got a D here. We can play a D minor 9 like this, or we could play the same chord like this, or we could maybe play the same chord like this. There's a lot of different ways to play the same thing. When you start playing from left to right on the bottom row, you will reach the end, and then you can continue playing on the next row. So let me show you that. If I continue playing up the scale here, can continue by then moving up a row. Okay, and you'll notice that right here is where the overlap happens, where this is the same note. This is helpful so that you don't have to jump so far so often. Okay, so instead of maybe jumping from here to here, right, I can simply just move up a row. All right, this is laid out very similarly to the fretboard of a guitar or bass. So to start, we're going to focus on what is called one octave, okay, which is one repetition of that series of notes that we covered. So in this case, it's from C to C just one time. Okay, that group of notes is what you could call an octave. And octaves are simply repetitions of the same note at higher frequencies. Okay, so this is a C, this is also a C, also a C, also a C, just going higher and higher in pitch. And keep in mind that pitch on push goes moving upwards and towards the right. Okay, so as we continue to go up rows, it goes higher in pitch as well as from left to right. Okay, so generally the notes flow in this direction in terms of pitch. Steps are the relationship between notes. Okay, so a half step is a one note distance which equals one pad. So for example, if we have C here, okay, a half step would be one pad higher, okay, to C sharp or D flat, okay, and a whole step is a two note distance, which is two pads, okay, so again, if we start at C, a whole step would be skipping a pad and playing two pads away to D. Next, let's talk about sharps and flats. So let's look at the dark pads. Each of these pads can have two note names depending on the context. To recap, we have all of our what are called naturals, which are just simply the letter names in the musical language. So we have C, D, E, F, G, A, B, and then back to C. But now we have all of these darker pads. For example, starting one note above C, we could say is a half step above C. Okay, so from here, if this is C, we could say that this pad is a half step above C. We could also say that relative to D, it is a half step below D, okay? So this is what we call sharps and flats. If it's above a natural tone, a note with no sharps or flats, so like, for example, C, right? It's called sharp. So this pad relative to C, we could call C sharp, okay? And flats would be below a natural note, so in this case D, and below D would be D flat. If we move this note up, let's say over here, right, we could call this either D sharp in relation to D, or we could call it E flat in relation to E. It's 100% worth taking the time to memorize the note layout on push in chromatic mode set to C major. I encourage you to make this part of your practice routine. It's super helpful if ever you're playing with another musician and for keeping push consistent to build muscle memory. So let me show you what I mean. If you keep this set to C major, okay, you can target B flat minor because I know where that is. You could go E flat minor 9. Maybe you want to go F sharp major, right? You can really target these notes intuitively because you know where they are. And the better you can get this committed to your muscle memory, the easier it will be for you to recall a chord or play a scale instantly. All right, so here's a few tips for you to help you commit this to memory. Know that in this setting, C major, that your dark pad will always be C. Okay, that is always C. From there, the next note that you can start to memorize is the note of D, which is a whole step above C. And you can see this visually. So you can see a C there, which is funny. And if you just go a whole step over C, that's D. Okay, so it will always have that visual relationship towards that dark pad. So I can tell that this is a D already, this is a D, there's another D here, right? And that's something to internalize. From there, we're going to talk more about this when we get to intervals, but there's another way to look at a D, which is this shape from a C, okay? It's just a different visual representation, but it's the same thing from a different reference point, okay? So you can see that this is a D relative to that C, D relative to that C, D relative to that C, or D relative to this C, relative to this one, relative to this one. Okay, so we'll know that this is a D as well over here. All right, and then from here, you can start to see and play with the different relationships of these notes to each other, which is what music is all about. It's all about relationships, baby. All right, so let's go to the next note. Let's go for E. All right, so we have C, D, E. Okay, and you can see that to the left one and up one is an E relative to C, right? So no matter where we see a C, we're going to see this shape. Okay, another shape for that same interval, you can see it right here, is this shape from a C. Okay, so for example, over here, we have this shape. Over here, we can't see one to the left and one over, so we can see that shape. Okay, and again, it's worth taking the time to see like, all right, well, how does this look relative to this C, right? That's a shape. It's the same note, okay, just with a different reference point. Same with this note relative to this C. Right? Another way to see the same relationship. Well, if we think of, let's say, G, for example, it can take a while to count up C, D, E, F, G to find G, okay? And this is where the advantage of the visual nature of push comes in, is that we can just see that G is directly below C, okay? So wherever we see C, again, we know that these are all G notes directly below that root. Okay, and you can also memorize this shape, which is very important. Okay, that relationship is C to G. All right, and then once you have all your natural notes down, so your C, D, E, F, G, A, B, back to C, and you really have that internalized and you've taken some time, then it's very easy to find your sharps and flats. Okay, you just reference those naturals. So for example, if I want to find B flat, it's like, okay, I know this is B, we flatten it. Here's our B flat. Right? Here's our B, here's our B flat. If we want to find, let's say, F sharp, for example, okay, well, here's our F sharp, so on and so forth. And just one thing to keep in mind that we haven't covered is that in the musical alphabet here, notice that between B and C and E and F, there is only a half step. So for example, if I go C to D, we have a note in between, okay? If we go D to E, we have a note in between, but then going from E to F, notice how there's no note in between E and F. Okay, that's important to remember. Then we go from F to G, there's a note in between, G to A, note in between, A to B, note in between once again, and then finally we have B and C, which are right beside each other, okay? So just keep that in mind that E and F and B and C don't have a sharp or flat between them. Now we understand the nuts and bolts of the language of music, but to make use of this knowledge in a musical way, we need to cover what scales are, okay? So scales are simply just a collection of notes at its most basic definition. So we're going to explore the most popular scales by far, and there's a bunch more that we're not going to check out in this video just for brevity's sake, but let's go ahead and check some of these out. Scales are built by stacking half steps and whole steps. The major scale is made of 5 whole steps and 2 half steps. So between 3 and 4, which is your E and F, and between 7 and 1, which is B and C, there's a half step, versus everything else is a whole step. And this is what gives scales their quality, character, and color, is the pattern of half steps and whole steps that make them up. Let's look at the pattern of a major scale to start. Something that's worth committing to memory is this pattern: whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. This pattern will work for any major scale. In the scale of C major, we have C, we have a whole step to D, whole step to E, half step to F, whole step to G, whole step to A, whole step to B, half step to C. So we have whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. And this can apply to any key. For example, let's do C sharp. We can just use the pattern to find C sharp major. So we have C sharp, whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. And you can see that that sounds exactly the same, but just simply has a different tonal center. Right? One thing to notice is that visual pattern is also always the same. This is the advantage of having rows of pads tuned differently. It gives you a lot of visual feedback. So I would encourage you to practice this with a bunch of different major scales to internalize that. And again, start to remember the note names and the shapes that you see. Next, let's look at the minor scale. We can't talk about the major scale or major keys without talking about minor scale and minor keys. So in general, people will say that a major scale sounds happy, stable, consonant, whatever you want to call it. And minor is a little bit more sad or serious or dissonant. Just for now, I'm going to go ahead and change the layout of push to reflect C minor. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that. And now we are looking at C minor on the pads. And side note, push is very powerful as a tool to teach you theory. Okay, as you can see, we can learn what a minor scale is with what we've learned so far. We're going to get more into intervals, but right now we can see that here's our root and we just play up the lit pads to play our minor scale. All right, so let's take a look at what happens here. Let's go back to major. All right, so if you're looking really closely, you can see that the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and the 7, okay? These notes get shifted down one, which is also called flattened. Minor scale is made of 5 whole steps and 2 half steps, just like our major scale, but the half steps are between the 2 and 3 and between the 5 and 6 instead of the 3 and 4 and the 7 and the 1. Okay, you can get a minor scale simply by flattening the 3rd, the 6th, and the 7th notes of a major scale, okay? So in this case, the 3rd, the 6th, and the 7th are a half step lower or flattened when compared to the major scale. Okay, so it's very common to hear musicians say that a minor scale has a flat 3, flat 6, and flat 7. All right, so if we look at this visually, right, here's our minor scale, right, versus our major scale. So notice how our 3rd note, our 6th note, and our 7th note all get moved down a half step. Another way to look at minor is simply starting the pattern from a different position of our whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. Okay, so instead of whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half, it's whole, half, whole, half, whole. Okay, and that might sound overwhelming, and that's okay. Okay, if you're learning this and it's new, no worries, it'll become internalized over time. But that is another thing that's worth remembering, is the pattern of half steps and whole steps that make up minor. So again, we have, starting here, you can see this on push. We have our root, then we have a whole step, then we have a half step, right? Then a whole step again, whole step, half step, whole step, whole step. So again, whole, half, whole, half, whole. So an easy way to remember it is just starting here, you have a whole step, and then it's half, whole, half, whole. So let's go back to the C major scale for now, and it's good practice to play the C minor scale while looking at the C major chromatic setting so you can visually see the flattened notes with the dark pads. Now, if we flatten the 3, flatten the 6, and flatten the 7, we can visually see that on the pads. Right, we can see that the 3, the 6, and the 7 are now being played on unlit pads. Eventually, the goal is that you want to become so familiar with the chord shapes on push that it doesn't really matter what you're looking at in terms of the lights on the pads. You want to detach from what you're looking at unless it's the C major chromatic mode, okay? Because at the end of the day, like, it's going to be shapes and understanding the note positions, the note names. So regardless if we're seeing C major here, well, we can just as easily play A flat minor, right? Side note is I really like to have fixed mode on. So in the scale selector here, there's a button that turns on fixed or off. You can toggle it here. And I usually keep this on because what this does is it essentially, no matter what setting you have, right, it will always be relative to C major in the pads. So in other words, this will always be C no matter what setting you have. So for example, if I go to D minor, I can see with the pads what D minor is, which is great, but this is still C. So I can still play all the familiar stuff that I know, and the same notes are on the same pads. All right, number 3. Now that we know the 2 most common scales and what scales are in general, we can move on to what, in my humble opinion, is the most powerful concept in music theory, intervals, because everything in music can be broken down into intervals, and it keeps you focused on what's most important in music and music theory, and that is relationship. If a note is a single pitch, then an interval is the distance between 2 notes, okay? And everything in music is made of intervals. In other words, relationships. It's all about relationships. I'll say it again. We are studying relationship in music theory. Now, it's worth noting that every possible distance from one note to another has a specific name. And from any specific reference point, so in this case, C, every single note in relationship to C or any other reference note is what is called an interval and has a specific name and sound. So we're going to start with the most important interval, and that is the octave and unison. Okay, so essentially the same note happening on higher or lower frequencies can be seen as an octave and or unison. So C and the same C is unison. You're playing the exact same note, just as before we were playing the 2 F notes. These are the exact same note, that is unison. And then the next interval is the octave, which is the same note, but higher or lower frequency. Octaves specifically are going to come into play immediately as we start getting into chords and inversions. And if you want to level up from the basic triad voicing, which we'll get into in just a sec, octaves can be a very easy way to unlock this. So if we remember our formula of 2 pads up and 2 pads to the right, to get an octave, 1, 2, 1, 2, or 3 pads to the left and 3 pads up, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. To get our octave, we can really get different voicings of a chord. So this is a basic major triad. We could move this up an octave. Get another inversion of a triad. We could move this up an octave. That's another inversion. We could move this down an octave. So all of those are different variations of the same notes, just in different octaves, okay? And this unlocks so much possibility for inversions, for different voicings, etc. So once you master the interval of the octave, you can really unlock chords and playing it in so many different ways very quickly. So for example, if we have a C major 7, okay, well, I could play that here just as well. I could play it here. I could play it here. I could go ahead and do this. Right? Those are all different voicings of the same chord. This is all simply being able to visualize octaves from a reference point. The other intervals are just as important as the octave, but I really wanted to emphasize the power of the octave to help you unlock literally everything. Next, let's look at the intervals of the major scale specifically. Okay, so we're going to look at the intervals that are inside the scale of C major. All right, so this is all going to be relative to the root, which in this case is C, okay? So all of the notes in C major will have a specific relationship to the root note of C. Let's go ahead and look at all the notes in C major relative to C to discover those intervals. And as we play these, I invite you to follow along, but also listen to how these intervals sound and how they make you feel, because in my experience, being able to quantify and develop a connection with these intervals in a visceral way, not only theoretically, but how it sounds, how it makes you feel, how it pulls the music in your own opinion and your own way of seeing things. Developing your ear and the feel of these intervals is just as important as the names, if not more important, okay? So C and D, if we play these 2, we have a major second interval, okay? And this has a sound. Okay, there's quite a bit of dissonance there, but if you kick this up an octave and add maybe a 5th, right, it can create a very nice sound. The next interval we have in our scale, right, is a major third, okay? Continuing up, we have our perfect fourth, perfect fifth, major sixth, major seventh, and then we're back at the octave. Each interval can be either raised or lowered, and we can divide them into two groups. Group one would be unison, octave, okay, perfect fourth, and perfect fifth. And then the second group would be your second, third, sixth, and seventh. Intervals in the first group are called perfect, and raising them by half step results in an augmented interval. So for example, if you had a perfect fourth and you wanted to raise this note one step higher, this would be called an augmented fourth, or a tritone in this case. Same goes for perfect fifth. You could have a perfect fifth and then lower it by a half step to get a diminished fifth, okay? And the second group will either be major or minor. So for example, major second, major third, they're considered unaltered because everything is compared to a major scale. And if they are flattened, okay, they are called minor intervals. So for example, this would be a minor sixth as opposed to a major sixth. And notice that the difference is that we flattened this major sixth into the minor sixth. Same goes for the major third into the minor third. So fun fact is the major scale only has major and perfect intervals. Notice how the second, the third, the sixth, and the seventh are all major, and the fourth and the fifth are perfect. This will help you a ton as you develop your musical vocabulary because every interval shape is movable and lets you make decisions. So from here, we have our major third. We can see it there. We can see it there. I could tell you that a major 7 chord has a root, a major third, a perfect fifth, and a major seventh on top, right? So we have root, major third, perfect fifth, major seventh all together, major seventh chord, and we'll get into chords in just a sec. Intervals are so powerful because as you're jamming, you can target specific little shapes and specific intervals instead of looking at everything full scale all the time in terms of and counting up. It's like we can just target the seventh, target the third, target the sixth, etc. So if you have a major 7 chord here, you can target the major third up here, right? Maybe you want the major sixth. Maybe you want to add the 9 on top, right? So you can just really pinpoint those intervals. Maybe we move up here, hit the 9 again, right? Maybe we go to a minor chord here and we hit the major sixth on top, right? Very nice. Major seventh, major third, root, so on and so forth. Next, let's look at the intervals in the minor scale that are different than the major scale. Okay, and we already covered this, but let's quickly recap. The minor scale, compared to the major scale, has a flat 3, a flat 6, and a flat 7. We're going to go 1, 2, 3. We're going to flatten that 3, 4, 5, flatten the 6, and then 7, flatten the 7. Right? So instead of playing the major third, the major sixth, and the major seventh, we're going to be playing the minor third, the minor sixth, and the minor seventh to get our minor scale. So one thing you can do to really start hammering this in and practicing it is to play up and down both the major and minor scales, just simply using the octave shape. And you can use 1 or 2 hands, whatever feels more comfortable, and just play up the scale. And I'd also do the same thing with the minor scale as well. So 1, 2, flat 3, flat 6, flat 7. And one thing to note while we're on the topic of major and minor scales is that parallel scales could be your C major scale and your C minor scale. They share the same root note, but have a different arrangement of whole steps and half steps. Now, relative scales are different, where, for example, if I were to play A minor, right? So now we're thinking A as our root note, and we're playing the same pattern that we have been so far. 1, 2, flat 3, 4, 5, flat 6, flat 7, back to A. One thing to notice is that as I'm playing this A minor scale, notice that I'm also playing only the lit up pads similar to C major. And that's because A minor has the same exact notes as C major, except just starting at a different place. So therefore, they are relative scales, okay? They share the same notes, but have a vastly different sound. And this is true of any major scale or any major key, that the sixth degree, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of any major scale or major key will be its relative minor. All right, section 4. Now we have really strong foundations in place and we can start exploring what is at the heart of harmony in music. Chords. Chords allow us to tell stories and express ourselves musically at a deeper level of emotion than just one or two notes being played together. We can really weave, again, complex relationships, tension and release through a chord progression to set the bedrock for harmony, to build other parts on top of, such as melodies, motifs, drums, bass lines, counterpoint, etc. So let's start by bringing this all together. We talked about notes, we talked about scales, we talked about intervals. Now let's talk about chords. You could think of a chord as the equivalent of a word in spoken language. It's made up of multiple notes, just like a word is made up of multiple letters. So a single note is a pitch, an interval is the relationship or the distance between two notes, and a chord is three or more notes being played together. All right, so the most basic chord is called a triad, okay? And it's made of a root, a third, and a fifth, okay? And the basic formula for creating a triad or chord out of the notes of a scale is to play a note, skip a note, play a note, skip a note, and then play a note once again. So for example, in C major, right, if we wanted to build a chord off the first degree, we would play that first note, skip the D, play the E, skip the F, and play the G. So there is our C major triad. We can do the same thing with D, for example. So let's play it down here. Okay, we're going to play this note. We're going to skip over the E. We're going to play the F. We're going to skip over the G. And we're going to play the A. So we get a D minor triad. Okay. All right. So any chord that you come across is made of specific notes, and it's those intervals that give a chord its quality. For example, if we just take C major triad and this D minor triad, just for comparison's sake, we can visually see the difference there. And a major triad, you can see, has a root, a major third, and a perfect fifth to make this triad, whereas a minor triad has a root, minor third, perfect fifth, right? And that's what gives that chord its quality, right? This is a minor chord, and this is a major chord. Okay, now let's cover the diatonic triads of C major. And that's a fancy way of saying that chords can be built from each what is called a scale degree of C major. Okay, so if we look at C major, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, each of those notes can be the root note of a triad. Let's play a triad from every note in the C major scale and pay special attention to what kind of triad that we get. Okay, and this is really important to internalize because every major key has this exact same order of triads. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that. We have number 1 starting with C. Let's go ahead and skip the D, play the E, skip the F, play the G. We get a C major triad. A 1 chord is a major chord. Now let's go to D. We'll play D, skip E, play F, skip G, play A. Right, so we get a D minor triad, so our 2 chord is minor. Let's continue. E, we have E, we skip the F, we play G, we skip the A, we play B. We get a minor triad once again, so our 3 chord is minor. If we go from F, skip this G, play the A, skip the B, play the C, we get a major triad once again. Okay, so our 4 chord is major. Continuing on with G, skip the A, play the B, skip the C, play the D. We get another major triad, so our 5 chord is major. If we go from A, skip the B, play the C, skip the D, play the E on top, we get a minor triad, very cool. And then finally, we have B, we'll skip the C, we'll play D, we'll skip the E, and we'll play the F on top. And we get a diminished triad. Notice how this is different than a major triad or a minor triad. We have a diminished triad on the 7th. Okay, so that's a very important thing to internalize is this order of triads. We have major, minor, minor, major, major, minor, diminished. So it's useful to repeat this to yourself as well as play it at the same time. You could say, okay, cool, C is our 1 chord, which is major. D is our 2 chord, which is minor. E is our 3 chord, which is minor. 4 is our F chord, which is major. 5 is our G chord, which is major once again. 8 is our 6 chord, which is minor. That's also the relative minor. And then B is our diminished chord. 7th chord is diminished. And then we're back home to our first major chord. You'll typically see this represented as Roman numerals from 1 to 7. Uppercase Roman numerals represent major chords and lowercase Roman numerals represent minor chords. Now let's go ahead into the minor scale in a minor key and examine the order of those triads. Okay, so if we go ahead and do that formula once again, starting on C, play 1, skip 1, play 1, skip 1, play 1, we get a minor triad for our 1 chord. Doing the same formula moving forward, we get a diminished 2. And here things get interesting. On our 3rd chord, we get an E flat major, okay? So our 3 chord is major. If we continue on, our F is minor, which is our 4 chord. Our G is also minor, which is our 5 chord. Our 6 is major, but that's again A flat. Okay, A flat major is our 6 chord. And then here, B flat major is our 7 chord back home to our minor 1. So it's worth noting the order of these triads. Minor 1, diminished 2, major 3, minor 4, minor 5, major 6, major 7, back to minor 1. And one thing to notice is that a minor scale or minor key compared to a major scale or major key is simply starting the same order of triads but at a different place. Notice that in C major we had major 1, minor 2, minor 3, major 4, major 5, minor 6, diminished 7, major 1, right? And if we go to minor, well, picture starting at the 6th position of the major key, right? We have our minor 1, then right away at the diminished, right? Then major 1, minor 4, minor 5, major 6, major 7, back to the minor 1. So again, it's the same order of triads, just starting from a different beginning. There's a lot more colorful chords that we can get beyond the basic triad, right? We could go ahead and add a 7 on top. We could add a 9 on top. We could add this 11. So there's a lot of possibility here. And an easy way to remember this is that in a major key, your 1, 4, and 5 are major, and your 2, 3, and 6 are minor, and your 7 is diminished. In a minor key, it kind of flips around where your 1, 4, and 5 are minor, but then your 3, 6, and 7 are major, and your 2 is diminished. Next, let's talk about the Roman numeral system. It's a very useful system and way to communicate chord progressions and all sorts of stuff with other musicians. Someone might say like, hey, do a 2-5-1 or do a 6-2-5-1. And each note on a scale is referred to as a scale degree, and we can assign a number to it. You could just say this is your 1 chord and assume that you know that it's major. Or if I say, hey, can you play a 3 chord in C major? You know that it's minor, right? Etc. This is applicable to any key. Like for example, if we're in, I don't know, D major, right? Then your 1 chord is going to be D major. Your 1 chord is major. Your 2 chord is minor. Your 3 chord is minor, right? Your 4 chord major, so on and so forth. So this applies to any key that you're in. And in general, in music, you'll hear a lot of numbers being thrown out as you start getting more into music, jamming with people, analyzing songs, creating your own songs, etc. You'll hear people say 7th chords or add the 9 in the same context as, hey, it's a 2-5-1 with a 9 on the 5. And it could get a little crazy. People just throwing out numbers like, what are you even talking about, right? So for example, if someone says, hey, 2-5-1, they're assuming that you understand what a 2 chord, what a 5 chord, and what a 1 chord is in a major key. So in this case, if we're just sticking in C major, right, a 2-5-1 would be your D, would be your 2 chord, your D minor into your G dominant, your 5 chord, which is major, the dominant 7 on top, and then your 1 chord, right? And this is great because it leaves things open for interpretation. If someone says a 2-5-1, cool, the motion of the triads is going to be, right? But you can color that. You could go ahead and maybe we add the 7 and the 9 on the 1 chord, right? Then maybe we add the 7 and the 9 on the 7 chord. And then same thing on this chord. So you're coloring it with intent, right? So you can have some fun, but it will still have the same core emotional movement of that chord progression. The 2-5-1 has a certain kind of pull to it, no matter how you color it. So that's where the power of this Roman numeral system comes in. Now let's look at creating chord progressions. Now that we understand basic chord qualities with triads, let's start piecing together chord progressions. You can see chord progressions as making a sentence or a phrase, telling a story, making a statement. In popular music, you'll usually see chord progressions with 2 to 4 chords. But if you're into classical, jazz fusion, or more progressive rock stuff, you'll usually see more chords going on. But let's keep it simple and just start simple. Let's just do like a 1-4-1 with basic triads. So in this case, here's our 1 chord. Cool, let's go to 4, and then back to 1. Right, we could also go 1 here and 4 over here, back to 1 down here. Notice how those have different pulls to them, right? And even just a 1-4-1 has a vibe, right? You can go a lot of different ways with chords. There's pretty much infinite possibility, but a lot of the time you will return to the chord that you started from for that sense of resolution and repetition. One of the most powerful tools with a progression is repetition in general. So as with anything in creativity, it can be useful to set limitations such as a specific chord progression to really jumpstart your creativity. And then you can use this as a framework to create your own progressions. So just start with a chord that you like the sound of. So I'm gonna go ahead and find, let's play right here, this A flat, okay? And I'm gonna play the minor 3rd, we'll add the 5th, and I'm gonna add this minor 7th on top. That's a nice chord, cool. Maybe from here I go down to a 5 over here. That's cool. So I like the sound of this, back to 1. And then back home. Very simple, right? That's how I would encourage you to start exploring this. Okay, from here, maybe we go somewhere else. Let's go back to that 5. And then maybe let's go over here to this major 7, and then back here. Right? That's a nice progression. I dig that. And just start playing around and practice going from 1 chord to 1 and back to where you started, and start to feel the pull of that, right? Right? Notice the difference that adding that chord in brought to the progression, right? And then from there, you can maybe add a 4th chord, right? And really just have some fun with this and start adding maybe some extra tones on top. Go up to the 5 this time, right? Then we go down here, and instead of going down here, I'll go up, right? So there's a lot of possibility even with very simple constraints. All right, so here's some suggestions as to how you can start getting these triads familiar and getting them under your fingers. What I would do is simply play up and down both the major and minor scale, playing those triads, saying them out loud, and getting them under your fingers, okay? And you can use 1 or 2 hands, whatever feels more comfortable. You don't really have to overthink the technique at this point. But for example, with a major scale, I would just start, okay, here's our major 1 chord. Let's go to our minor 2 chord, minor 3 chord, major 4 chord, major 5 chord, minor 6 chord, diminished 7 chord, back to 1. Same thing with minor as well. So here's our minor 1, our diminished 2, major 3, minor 4, minor 5, major 6, major 7, and then your minor 1. From there, we can get into way more advanced stuff where instead of playing a triad like this, I tend to play them like this, which is a more open voicing and easier to play with 1 hand. Same with a minor triad. Instead of playing it like this, you can also play it like this. Okay, and now that you can have more of an open voicing here, and you can really play it with 1 hand easily. All right, we just covered a really solid foundation to music theory on Push. I think that from there, you have all the building blocks to now express yourself, to discover more, to learn more advanced techniques, etc. If learning more advanced music theory or specific musical techniques, performance techniques is something you're interested in, let me know in the comments down below what you'd like to see. I'm always open ears to hearing what you'd like to see on this channel. If you want to go a little bit deeper into exploring these foundations, but a little bit more in depth, I invite you to check out this playlist where I explore all these concepts, but a little bit deeper in separate videos and a really cool playlist, okay? So if you want to learn music theory a little bit deeper on Push, I invite you to check that out, and I will see you in that next video.